Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most transformative moments in American history, but we're going to look at it through a really unique lens, the lens of design. We'll see how a nation, one built on a deeply flawed and contradictory design, was literally forced by crisis to redesign its entire identity.
So, here's our roadmap. First, we'll frame the Civil War as a crisis of a flawed national design. Then, we'll get into the pressures that forced a radical change, look at the redesign itself, see its dramatic public impact, and wrap up with the unfinished work that, continues to this day. Okay, let's jump right into Section 1. We've got to start by looking at the nation's original blueprint, you could say. And we need to understand why, from a design perspective, it was pretty much destined to fail. This quote from W.E.B. Du Bois just flips the whole script, right? He's arguing this wasn't some simple moral crusade. No, this was a change that came out of immense, unbearable strategic pressure. Emancipation, from this point of view, wasn't just a choice. It became an absolute military necessity to win the war. Now, to really get this, we can use a modern concept from an equity designer named Caroline Hill, the idea of the public body. Think of it like this. The entire nation is a single, interconnected body. And the institution of slavery? Well, it wasn't just some flaw in the system. It was a deep, festering wound that was tearing that body apart from the inside. So, early in the war, President Lincoln had what you might call a design brief, and his main objective was super clear and super limited. The goal was simple: preserve the Union. Everything else, and that includes the fate of 4 million enslaved people, was a distant second to that one goal. And look, you don't have to take my word for it. This quote says it all. In this famous letter, Lincoln makes it crystal clear just how committed he was to that original design, a design that put the structure of the nation way ahead of the health of its public body. But, as we're about to see, that design just couldn't hold. So, what happens when a flawed design crashes into reality? Well, it comes under unbearable pressure. And in Section 2, we're going to see how that pressure forced a total reevaluation of the war's purpose, and really the nation's future. The pressure was coming from two directions. On one side, you had this relentless moral crusade from abolitionists like Wendell Phillips and Horace Greeley, and on the other, you had a total cascade of strategic crises. The Union just wasn't winning, thousands of enslaved people were freeing themselves by running to Union lines, and, to top it all off, Britain and France were getting dangerously close to recognizing the Confederacy. And this connects so perfectly to this modern idea of designing at the margins. The enslaved people who were fleeing bondage, the ones with the closest hand on reality, they were sending the clearest signal possible that the old design was totally broken. Their actions painted a much truer picture of the war than any strategy session happening back in Washington. Which brings us to the big question, right? In September of 1862, Lincoln publicly said that an Emancipation Proclamation would be as useless as a Pope's bull against the comet. Then, just 9 days later, he issues a preliminary one. So what on earth happened? What forced such a massive, whiplash-inducing pivot? Well, all that intense pressure led directly to the climax of our story, the ultimate redesign of the war's entire purpose and the nation's very identity. The Emancipation Proclamation, this wasn't just some document. It was a complete strategic and moral overhaul. It totally rewrote the design brief. Suddenly, the war wasn't just about preserving the old Union anymore. It was about forging a brand new one. And the language in the proclamation itself really shows this dual purpose. It's framed as an act of justice, right? A moral thing to do. But it's also explicitly warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. So you've got this moral awakening that's being driven by, and frankly made possible by, cold, hard strategic reality. And this redesign, it sent shockwaves all over the world. In England, working people held these huge rallies celebrating Lincoln's move, and that basically ended any threat of British intervention. Meanwhile, the Confederacy just erupted in fury, which, ironically, was proof that the proclamation had struck a fatal blow. But here's the thing. A new design is really just a theory on paper until you test it. And this new design was about to be proven in the most public, most dangerous arena you can imagine, the battlefield. 186,017. Let that sink in. That's the official number of black men who enlisted in the Union Army. Lincoln himself later said that victory would have been impossible without them. So this wasn't some minor contribution. This was a decisive force that absolutely turned the tide of the war. Frederick Douglass saw exactly what was happening here. He understood the profound symbolism. Military service was a form of practicing in public. By putting on that uniform and fighting for the nation, these men were making a claim to citizenship and belonging that was simply undeniable. And this is just a perfect historical example of what designers today call radical inclusion. The enlistment of Black soldiers was this intentional act that just shattered the old design of exclusion. It forced the nation to see, to value, and to actually depend on the very same people it had previously dehumanized. But redesigning a system that's built on supremacy is never ever without a backlash. The New York City draft riots in '63 were just this horrific explosion of violence. You had class anger over a draft that let the rich buy their way out, and all that anger got twisted and redirected toward the city's Black population. It just goes to show how violently a system will fight back when its unjust foundations are challenged. And that brings us to the final part of this historical redesign. Because it was powerful, it was absolutely nation-altering. But it was far from complete. The work of redesigning for true equity had really only just begun. And this, right here, is the core idea from Caroline Hill's work. If we could understand that systems of racism and inequity were intentionally designed, they were built by people, then that means we also have the power to dismantle them and to redesign them. They are not inevitable forces of nature. They are choices. So modern frameworks like equityXdesign actually give us a process for how to keep this work going. It starts with ourselves. It focuses on healing relationships, and it uses these small, intentional actions, that practicing in public idea again, to build a more just and equitable future, together. When you look at it this way, this whole history shows us that even a nation's foundational design can be broken and completely rebuilt when the moral and strategic costs just get too high. And that brings the question back to us, right here, right now. What flawed designs in our world are you ready to change?